On June 22, 2025, the US carried out a massive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. This isn't the first time it's happened. In fact, it's become a bit of an American tradition, but it wasn't always this way. In fact, Iran used to be one of America's closest allies in the Middle East. We literally gave them their first nuclear reactor. So what changed? In order to answer that question, we're going to take a dive into Iran's history. We'll explore the origins of one of the oldest countries on Earth, the huge imperialist interest in it, and the revolution that changed everything. Iran is one of the oldest countries in the world. Its modern borders overlap what was Mesopotamia in ancient times, one of the earliest human civilizations. The history of the region is long and complex, with dozens of different factions and rulers holding power at different points. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to start in the year 1900, when Western powers first set their gaze on the country. William Knox Darcy was an English businessman who, after making a massive fortune in New Zealand through his mining company, moved back to England and set his sights on a new venture. Iran, then called Persia, was untapped when it came to oil, and Darcy was approached by some English prospectors to bankroll an oil venture in the country. He agreed and made a deal with the Shah of Persia that guaranteed him exclusive oil rights to most of the country. In return, a small percentage of the profits would be paid back to the Persian government. Unfortunately for Darcy's team, oil was not as easy to find as they expected. They drilled for 6 years without finding anything, and it was so expensive that Darcy had to get another company to buy into the project. That company was the Burma Oil Company, and they'll be extremely important later. They bought into the venture as a majority stakeholder, with Darcy's company becoming a subsidiary. Despite the new investment, they still weren't having any luck. They moved drilling sites multiple times to no avail. Eventually, they decided to throw in the towel and accept failure, and gave the order to pack up. But the team on the ground delayed that order, and by a stroke of luck, they struck oil. Big time. Together, the Burma Oil Company and Darcy set up the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to manage the whole operation. It was extremely profitable and was so important to Britain's oil supply that the British government eventually bought a majority share of the company, effectively nationalizing it. So we've seen that the British Empire had a large stake in the country, but they weren't the only ones. In addition to Britain, the Russian Empire also enjoyed meddling in Persian affairs and had been doing so for well over a century. In fact, these two imperial powers were so pushy that their back and forth meddling came to be known as the Great Game. But at the onset of World War I, there were new players in the so-called Great Game. The German and Ottoman empires found themselves allied against the Russians and British, and they wanted to cut off their influence in the region. So, they invaded. The Persian government tried to maintain its sovereignty, but its military was nowhere near strong enough to repel all the foreign invaders, so the country remained occupied by these four for most of the war. Thankfully, most of these occupiers dealt with themselves. The Russian forces left after the revolution and the takeover of the Bolshevik government, and the Germans and Ottomans were expelled following their defeat in World War I. This just left the British, who sought to solidify their position in the country. They did this with a new deal, the Anglo-Persian Agreement, which reaffirmed British oil rights in the country. The deal was negotiated between the two countries, but it was never officially ratified by the Persian government. Why? Because it seemed like there might have been better options than the British. With the overthrow of the Tsar in Russia, the new Bolshevik government declared that all the old deals with Persia were null and void, halting the exploitation of the country that had been in place for decades. All that they wanted in return was for a new deal to be made. To guarantee support for this deal, the Soviet government began an information campaign against the British, which worked wonders for shifting public opinion against them. They translated articles from the Soviet press and distributed them throughout Persia. They held meetings with local tribes in various regions where they called on them to throw off the shackles of imperialism. But they also got a bit carried away and sent troops to Persia, which helped the Marxist forces within the country form breakaway regions. Now caught between a rock and a hard place, the Persian government stalled. All this waiting had the populace fed up, and one man decided to make his displeasure known. His name was Reza Khan. He was a Cossack general who had enough troops loyal to him that he literally just walked into the capital and took control with basically no blood spilt. Under his decisive leadership, he negotiated the withdrawal of Soviet troops, forced the British out, mostly, and unified the country under the name Iran for the first time. Although unified, the country was still behind in terms of infrastructure, and he needed help to fix it. But Reza Shah, as he became known, did not trust the British and Russian governments, and rightfully so. They had exploited his country for generations, and invaded anytime the country went in a direction they didn't like. So he turned to a different country for aid, Germany. This proved to be a big problem when World War II broke out, since the British still had major oil interests in the country. In fact, the Abadan refinery was the largest oil refinery in the world at this point, and it was used to fuel the British Navy. Tensions were predictably high because of this, but the final nail in the coffin was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Iran Iran happened to have a large border with the Soviet Union, as well as extensive railroads that could be used to send supplies. This, along with the threat of German influence in the country, was a good enough reason for action, so Russia and Britain launched a joint invasion and quickly took over the country. And when I say quick, I mean it. The Anglo-Soviet forces took the country in less than a week, and promptly exiled Reza Shah to the British colonies in Africa, where he spent the rest of his life. The occupying forces placed his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in charge, although it was mainly a symbolic move since the country was completely occupied. This takeover did serve its purpose though, with Iranian infrastructure being used extensively throughout the war to send supplies to the Soviet Union. In fact, over 30,000 Americans worked the supply lines, and their presence helped quell the fear that Russia and Britain would simply continue their occupation after the war. These fears were further relieved by the signing of the Tehran Declaration, where Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin declared that Iran would gain back its sovereignty after the war. Fun fact, there was actually a German plan to assassinate all three leaders at the Tehran conference, as it was one of the few times they were all in the same place at the same time during the war. When the war wrapped up and time came to abide by the Tehran Declaration, the British actually kept their word and pulled their troops out, but the Soviets were a different story. During the war, communist militants in Iran began a campaign to establish breakaway states, and the occupying Soviet troops actually stopped the Iranian military from fighting back. They continued to stay even after the war ended and after the breakaway states were formed, essentially turning them into puppet states for the Soviet Union. After nearly a year of occupation, Iran put forth the first formal complaint against another country in the newly formed UN, and with the US supporting the measure, the Bolshevik troops finally withdrew. With the country finally back under his control, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi attempted to continue his father's work of secularizing the country. His dad had been big on westernization, with many Western-style establishments like movie theaters and bars opening up under his rule. He also had some very controversial policies, like a ban on hijabs in public, forcing women to show their hair in an unprecedented move for a majority Shia Muslim country. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi tried to continue this work, but he wasn't terribly popular. Who was popular was Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected prime minister of the country. He was a true populist, enacting policies like unemployment benefits, mandatory sick pay, and the move that would be his downfall, the nationalization of Iranian oil. Mossadegh and most of the population of Iran was unhappy with the current oil deal, with the British getting the vast majority of the oil profits while the Iranian government got a meager 16%. He suspected that they weren't even getting that much, so he requested an audit of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, but they refused. In a stunning response, the Iranian parliament voted in favor of nationalizing the oil industry. They seized all British oil assets and expelled British corporate representatives in an event that came to be known as the Abadan Crisis. In response to these moves, Britain blockaded the city of Abadan, pulled out all their workers, and froze all British bank accounts relating to Iranian oil. Mossadegh's government had expected some of these moves and planned to sidestep them by enlisting other countries' specialists to train Iranians to run the oil rigs. But in solidarity with Britain, every other country except Italy refused, leaving Iranian oil largely unrefined. Despite this, Mossadegh remained unyielding, convinced that eventually Iran would come out on top. Britain seemed to have a similar fear, so they came up with a plan to deal with the problem: overthrow the government. They recruited the US to help with this, and together they paid protesters, hired gangsters, and empowered an Iranian general to take over the government and arrest Mossadegh, sentencing him to 3 years of prison and then a lifetime of house arrest. After removing the only democratically elected leader that Iran has ever had, they put his predecessor, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, back in charge. He happily worked with the Western powers to restore their oil deals, moves that were not popular with the people. Despite his unpopularity, the Shah remained in power for the next 26 years, largely thanks to Soapbox, the Iranian secret police that were used to crush dissent in the country, secret police that we, the USA, funded and trained ourselves. This strategy of total control worked for a time, but the people of Iran were frustrated, and when you have that many angry people, all you need is a spark to ignite them. In 1963, Mohammad Reza implemented new extreme liberal policies which came to be known as the White Revolution. These included voting rights for women, nationalization of forests and pastures, and land reform, which was meant to gain support from the rural workers who actually worked the land. Unfortunately, this backfired, and the upper classes in Iran began to rebel. The main force of this opposition was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious leader whose vocal opposition to the government landed him in jail in 1963, and then exiled the next year. Khomeini feared that Western influence influences of the country had gone too far, and he wished to return it to its religious roots. He dreamed of an Islamic republic where Sharia law of Islam was strictly followed. Not everyone shared this dream of his, but since he was a religious leader, the secular opposition expected that he would be a spiritual leader and that they would work on actual policy, so they collaborated with him. Despite being exiled, Khomeini was very influential in the country. Smuggled tapes of his speeches circulated, with more and more people warming to the idea of revolution, especially with the recent moves the Shah had been making. His family was only becoming more wealthy thanks to oil profits, while the general populace lived in poverty. Instead of increasing spending on the people, he threw an extravagant event for the 2500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire. He also angered the religious population by changing the first year of the Iranian calendar from a religiously significant one to the year that Cyrus the Great ascended to the throne in ancient Persia. There were also two suspicious deaths, the first being a popular Islamist theorist named Ali Shariati, and the second being Khomeini's son, Mustafa. Although it wasn't reflected in their official causes of death, many suspected that Soapbox had something to do with them. But things didn't really take off until January 7th, 1978, when an article was published which accused Khomeini of being a British agent. The article was actually written by a member of the Shah's government in an attempt to ruin Khomeini's credibility, but it backfired horribly. 2 days after it was published, a group of students who supported Khomeini began protesting in the streets. The Shah's government cracked down on them, firing live ammunition and killing between 500 and 300 protesters. These counts vary wildly because, as you'll see, Khomeini used inflated numbers as propaganda to further his cause. The deaths of these students was a catalyst, one that Khomeini deftly used to start one of the biggest protest movements in history. It's customary in Shia Islam to have a funeral 40 days after someone's death, and Khomeini used this 40 days timeline to plan another protest 40 days after the students were killed. These next protests were pretty large, and although most were peaceful, some turned violent and ended up with perceived symbols of Western influence like cinemas and bars in flames. As you would expect, the government cracked down, killing a number of protesters. In a viciously effective strategy, Khomeini used this to plan more protests 40 days after that. In what became an endless cycle, protests were held every 40 days, and when the Shah cracked down on them and killed more protesters, that became the fuel for the next demonstration. The Shah was completely taken aback by this strategy, but since something obviously wasn't working, he shifted gears. He instead tried appeasing the masses by allowing the protests, firing Soapbox agents, and apologizing to opposition leaders. This seemed to work pretty well. The protests died down in size, and a CIA report on the incident said that Iran, quote, is not in a revolutionary or even a pre-revolutionary situation. The CIA was dead wrong. Not only did the protests continue, but they exploded in size. Not thousands, but hundreds of thousands began participating. When Ramadan arrived, Khomeini fired up his supporters even more, saying it was their divine duty to protest the current regime. The Shah continued to bend over backwards to try to make the opposition happy, replacing the prime minister, releasing all political prisoners, and even trying his own family members for corruption. But the people were not having it. When a movie theater was burned by arsonists, killing hundreds of people, the public was quick to blame the attack on the Shah's government, even though it later came out that it was in fact the Islamic revolutionaries who were responsible. At the end of Ramadan, when Eid al-Fitr was celebrated, a massive open-air prayer was held in Tehran, with hundreds of thousands attending. Instead of simply praying, the organizers directed the crowd to march through Tehran as an act of protest. This inspired even larger gatherings in the coming days, which began calling for Khomeini's return from exile. That was a step too far for the Shah. He enacted martial law, issuing a curfew and punishing any who broke it. This backfired massively. A group of around 4,000 people broke curfew and got into an engagement with soldiers at Jaleh Square. When they refused to disperse, the soldiers fired on them, killing 64. This, along with other protests and clashes throughout the day, brought the death toll up to 89 in a day what had come to be known as Black Friday. Khomeini pounced on this opportunity to inflame his base, saying, quote, 4,000 innocent protesters were massacred by Zionists. In spite of his statement, the government also heavily criticized the event and allowed protests to continue, but it didn't matter what the government did to appease. The people were out for regime change, and regime change they would have. The next step in the protest movement was a strike by oil workers that nearly tripled the price of oil worldwide. The Shah's government once again cracked down on them, killing dozens, which only inflamed the movement more. It eventually became a general strike, with thousands of workers walking off the job, bringing the country to a standstill. The Shah recognized his heir and pulled the military out. He realized that he couldn't crush this movement with military might, so he moved to other means. In an attempt to cut his contact with other members of the clergy, the Shah pressured the Iraqi government to expel Khomeini, where he had been in exile for some time. This also backfired big time. Khomeini moved to a village near Paris, and with the superior telephone and postal connections, had greater access to his supporters than ever before. Even worse for the Shah, the Western media became fascinated by Khomeini and made him a household name, ballooning his popularity compared to the more moderate ayatollahs in the opposition movement. Even while secretly planning for an Islamic republic, Khomeini kept up his collaboration with other opposition leaders, even signing an agreement for a draft constitution that would be Islamic and democratic with the leader of the secular National Front, one of his main allies. All the while, protests continued in Iran with little interference from the government. When the military did respond to one protest at the University of Tehran, the entire city broke out into riots. Symbols of Western influence were torched, police stations were shot at, and the British embassy was attacked. After much pleading from his advisors, the Shah put a temporary military government into place to quell the protests and made a speech apologizing for the mistakes of his government, promising to do better. But Khomeini saw weakness and he struck. He said there would be no reconciling with the government and called on the Iranian people to overthrow them. In response, the government tried to thread the line between cracking down and appeasing. It broke up oil strikes while also prosecuting its own officials for corruption. Unfortunately for the Shah, these wishy-washy moves were ineffective. The biggest protests were still yet to come. Massive movements were planned for the holy month of Muharram, with especially large demonstrations planned for the holy days of Tasu'a and Ashura. On the first day of protests alone, more than 2 million people took part. And on the holy days themselves, between 6 and 9 million people, making it one of the largest protest events in history. The effect was staggering. The military began to defect, with soldiers killing their own officers and joining the protests. The situation became so dire that American intelligence considered rescinding their support for the Shah in an attempt to build a new pro-Western government before they lost all control. Seeing the situation dissolve before his very eyes, the Shah appointed a new prime minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, this time from the National Front, and fled the country. The people erupted with joy, tearing down symbols of the old monarchy, while the new prime minister encouraged the demonstrations and released all political prisoners. Khomeini, however, was not happy with the arrangement, and he, along with the rest of the National Front, condemned Bakhtiar for taking a government position from the Shah. Despite the condemnation, Bakhtiar still facilitated Khomeini's return to the country, but when he arrived, Khomeini declared that he would not accept Bakhtiar's government, saying, quote, "I shall kick their teeth in. I appoint the government. I appoint the government in support of this nation." He proceeded to do just that, creating a provisional revolutionary government and appointing Mehdi Bazargan as prime minister. Not only did he appoint him, but he claimed that it was all Iranians' religious duty to obey him. Khomeini called for demonstrators to take to the streets in support of his new government. The final straw came when a skirmish between pro-Khomeini and pro-Shah forces broke out at the Doshan Tepe air base. Khomeini supporters heard about this and mobilized, and along with Islamic Marxist guerrilla fighters, broke into a weapons factory, stealing some 50,000 machine guns, which they distributed to the public to help their struggle. The rebel forces began taking police stations and military bases, and not wanting to incur civilian casualties, the general in charge of Tehran's security decided not to intervene. The rest of the military also stayed put. The Supreme Military Council declared itself neutral in the struggle, effectively ceding the capital to Khomeini's forces. Bakhtiar fled the country, and after 15 years of dissent against the old Shah government, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini became the first supreme leader of Iran. Once in power, Khomeini began cracking down on his previous leftist allies. The government was turned not into a democracy, but a theocracy, with Sharia law forming the basis of the new order. Women had their rights taken away, despite their massive contributions to the protests that got Khomeini in power in the first place. The Marxist guerrilla fighters that had previously fought for Khomeini were now destroyed by his personal army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, in large-scale conflicts that killed upwards of 10,000. While Khomeini reorganized the government, his supporters had ideas of their own, and it's actually their actions that set the stage for modern Iranian-American relations. Things kicked off on October 22, 1979, when the US allowed former Shah Mohammad Reza to enter the United States to receive cancer treatment. This angered supporters of the Islamic Republic, who wanted him extradited back to Iran to be tried for his crimes while in power. The US refused, and in response, a group of students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. They initially planned to stay for a short time, no more than a week, but after Khomeini himself supported the takeover, it became so popular that they kept the occupation going. People saw it as a symbol of pushing back not only against America, but all imperial powers that had exploited the country for so long. The students' main goal was for the former Shah to be extradited back to Iran, but they also hoped that the moderate government of Prime Minister Bazargan would collapse under the international pressure, ceding ultimate power to Khomeini. It worked. Mehdi Bazargan and his cabinet resigned, and Khomeini, now unopposed, used the popularity of the situation to push through a referendum vote which officially turned Iran into an Islamic republic. The hostages were held for almost 2 years, being kept in a wide variety of conditions. They were allegedly beaten and tortured at various times throughout their captivity, all the while the Iranian government claimed they were being treated as guests. The American government attempted a rescue operation, but it failed, and worse than that, it caused the Iranians to distribute the hostages throughout the country so that a single rescue attempt was impossible. In light of that failure, the US instead put sanctions on Iranian assets, stopped buying their oil, and applied as much diplomatic pressure as possible, all moves with limited success. Only a few black and female hostages were released, with the revolutionary stating it was because they were sympathetic to the struggle of other minorities. A man who developed multiple sclerosis was also released, although not immediately after he began developing symptoms. Eventually, after 444 days, the hostages were released following negotiations led by Algeria. The US agreed to unfreeze Iranian assets, and Iran agreed to pay back its debts to the US, among many other provisions. But by the time this deal was signed, Iran had bigger issues, namely Saddam Hussein. He was the president of Iraq, the country which Iran has the longest land border with, and seeing that Iran had become weakened through the revolution, he sought to use that weakness to his advantage. He was afraid of the Islamic Revolution making its way to Iraq, where it could threaten his secular Ba'ath government. Although it was officially non-religious, his government was primarily made up of Sunni Muslims, and he was afraid that the revolution would inspire the Shia majority of Iraq to rise up against their minority rule. And it's not like this fear was unfounded. Khomeini publicly called for the people of Iraq to overthrow the Ba'ath government and become an Islamic republic, even after Saddam Hussein tried to ease tensions. This led to the Iraqi invasion of Iran, which Saddam expected to win quickly because of the severely diminished military power of his opponent. The Iranian army was weak and disorganized due to many executions and firings of high-level military personnel. Khomeini's government purged the military of anyone not loyal to him, which drastically reduced the amount of trained soldiers available for battle. In addition, the regular military had trouble communicating and working with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which led to widespread confusion. Despite all of this, the Iraqi assault was weak and ineffective. Although they captured a few cities, they were quickly repelled and brutalized by the much superior Iranian Air Force, which had been trained by the US under the old Shah. The two sides came to a stalemate after just 3 months of fighting. Eventually, after a few failed missions, the Iranian military got reorganized enough to launch a counteroffensive, which they did on the 22nd of March 1982 with Operation Fath al-Mubin. Iranian troops used Chinook helicopters to land behind Iraqi lines, and by dealing with their artillery, cleared the way for the Revolutionary Guard and the regular army to advance. This attack was extremely successful, and along with some other operations, forced the Iraqi military to retreat. They were so successful and cost the Iraqi military so many men that Saddam Hussein proposed a ceasefire just under 2 years into fighting. But Khomeini refused, saying the war would not be over until Iraq's current regime was replaced with an Islamic republic. It's possible that Iran could have actually achieved their goal. Iraq was severely weakened and was almost bankrupt for the war, but Khomeini's Islamic revolution had scared the world, and as such, they would not allow Iran to win this war. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, France, West Germany, and even the United States began supplying aid to Iraq. Ronald Reagan even signed a national security decision directive which determined, quote, the United States could not afford to allow Iraq to lose the war to Iran. The US provided loans, satellite imagery, intelligence information, howitzers, and even chemicals that were used to make weapons of mass destruction. All this aid, in addition to fresh supplies from the Soviet Union and China, meant that when Iran decided to counter-invade Iraq, they were not very successful. Iraq's defensive measures were designed not to stop the Iranian assault, but to bleed it of resources and manpower. Iran attempted to launch large-scale attacks on Iraqi defenses, using so-called human wave attacks to overwhelm with sheer numbers, but the entrenched defenses of the Iraqi military, along with the use of tear gas and other chemical weapons, was extremely effective and pushed the Iranians out of any territory they claimed. Even worse for Iran, Iraq managed to get air superiority thanks to tons of military aid from the aforementioned countries, and began bombing cities all over Iran in what became known as the War of the Cities. In a pattern that would be repeated many times throughout the war, Iran launched operations which temporarily gained them ground, but were then pushed back by Iraq's superior air force and use of chemical weapons, which Saddam deployed extensively throughout the war, including on civilian targets. Although Iraq had more supplies, the Iranian military was better trained, and they had much more manpower available due to having almost 3 times the population of Iraq. They managed to stage some successful operations, including an attack on the Al-Fa Peninsula, which they successfully captured and held against Iraqi assault. In response, Saddam ordered an attack on the Iranian city of Mehran. The Iraqi military military successfully took the city, and Saddam offered to trade it back to Iran in exchange for Al-Fa. Khomeini refused, and less than 2 months later his forces retook Iran, dealing yet another blow to the Ba'ath government's reputation. Despite limited successes from both sides, the war still remained a stalemate. So in April 1986, after nearly 6 years of fighting, Khomeini issued a declaration stating that the war must be won in the next year. Iran recruited 650,000 additional volunteers and launched renewed attacks, but with limited success. At the same time, Iraq began massively ramping up their military spending and training. They began running war simulations in the desert, practicing strategies and maneuvers in an attempt to catch up to the Iranian military skill. While they did that, Iran attempted to seize the city of Basra in what ended up being the largest battle of the war. Iranian forces repeatedly stormed the city, but the Iraqi defenses bled them the whole way there. By the time they would get close, they had lost too much momentum and were forced to retreat, only to try again shortly after. This back and forth led to Iran's eventual retreat, although not before an estimated 60,000 casualties, the vast majority of those on the Iranian side. After the failure to capture Basra, the Iranian military was war-weary and low on supplies. To keep their war effort strong, they supplemented their forces with Kurdish insurgents within Iraq and began taking territory in the mountains. But let's back up a minute to address one of the main reasons Iran couldn't get through: chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein was fascinated with them and deployed them extensively throughout the war. They even had different strategies with different chemicals, including one where they fired cyanide gas in front of the enemy advance to halt it, and then dropped mustard gas behind to catch them as they tried to retreat. These types of attacks only ramped up throughout the war, especially on Kurdish fighters. Another axis of this war, like most things involving Iran, was oil. Both countries relied on their oil exports to maintain their war machines, which made them obvious targets for one another. Oil tankers were consistently attacked throughout the war, with Iraq's allies like Kuwait also getting caught up in it. Iranian attacks on Kuwaiti tankers were so effective that the government asked the US to allow them to fly their flag on Kuwaiti ships. This sort of worked, but Iran was also extensively mining the waters. In one case, the US actually attacked Iran's navy because they had hit a ship flying the US flag with one of their mines. Iraq's renewed air force continued to wreak havoc on Iranian supply lines and infrastructure, and Saddam even started using it to perform his chemical attacks. In one instance, Iraqi planes dropped mustard gas bombs on the civilian population of a town, with up to 20,000 people being affected by that one attack. Despite Saddam's obvious war crimes, the world continued to support him. The fear of the Islamic Revolution spreading was too strong, like the fear of communism before it. In 1988, the Iraqi military was finally ready to carry out large-scale attacks after almost a year of drills. They launched over 200 missiles at 37 different Iranian cities, the largest missile attack of the entire war. Saddam even threatened to use chemical weapons in the missiles, which caused mass civilian exodus from cities like Tehran. During this time, Iran launched an operation targeting a large dam and power plant in Iraq. It was initially successful, but was once again thwarted by the mass use of chemical weapons by the Iraqi defenders. Iraq also used chemical weapons extensively to finally retake the Al-Fa Peninsula. In a desperate last attempt to counterattack, Iran sent in operatives to infiltrate Iraqi trenches, and they actually managed to reach the presidential palace before being forced back by the sheer numbers of Iraqi aircraft. In what was likely the final blow to the Iranian war effort, the Iraqi military captured the cities of Shalamcheh and Daloran inside Iran and seized a massive amount of equipment. From his new position of power, Saddam issued a threat to Khomeini, saying he would launch a new full-scale invasion of Iran using his renewed military and weapons of mass destruction if Khomeini did not accept a ceasefire. Under the backdrop of constant missile strikes, chemical bombing runs on civilians, and a war-weary and depleted Iranian military, Khomeini finally accepted the ceasefire. With more than 500,000 dead, the Iran-Iraq War ended as one of the deadliest in modern history. The Iranian military did remarkably well considering how few countries supported it. They developed their own military-industrial complex, designing and building many of their own weapons compared to Iraq's exorbitant spending to purchase weapons from other nations. If it hadn't been for the overwhelming support of the world for Iraq and their liberal use of chemical weapons, Iran may have conquered them and set up another Islamic republic like Khomeini hoped. After his failure to spread the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini's health began to decline. And it was no surprise, he was 89 at this point. After suffering 5 heart attacks in just 10 days, Khomeini finally passed away in June of 1989. His funeral attracted over 10 million people, a sixth of the country's entire population. It's estimated that this is the highest percentage of a population ever to attend a single event. Even after he was gone, Khomeini's influence was still felt on Iran. Shortly before his death, he appointed a 25-man council to lead the country in his absence. After he passed, the council elected Ali Khamenei, the then president, as supreme leader, and he still leads the country to this day. In the following decades, Iran attempted to normalize relations with much of the world following its isolation during the Iran-Iraq War. Despite this, relations with the US have remained frosty. There's been a trade embargo in place since 1995, and US presidents have gone back and forth on trying to work with the country. Relations reached their best in 2015 when the Obama administration helped negotiate a deal that limited Iran's nuclear program to strictly civilian purposes. Unfortunately, the US pulled out just a few years later under Donald Trump, and he ramped up the sanctions and attacks on the country. Now don't get me wrong, Iran is definitely not a friend to the US. They've backed many militias in the region, including Hezbollah and the Houthis, which have repeatedly attacked US forces over the years. They've also reportedly made plans to assassinate US officials. Following the outbreak of the Gaza war in 2023, relations got even worse due to the United States' support of Israel and Iran's support of Palestine. So to answer the question in the title, why do we keep bombing Iran? Because we're afraid. We're afraid of the Islamic Revolution spreading, just like we were afraid of communism. And so we do everything in our power to keep Iran weak, including strikes on their nuclear facilities, assassinations of their generals, and massive support for their main adversary, Israel. Iran's government is definitely not one to be admired. The theocratic regime is oppressive and discriminatory, with abundant human rights violations and support for terror all across the world. But we can't extract ourselves from the blame. We overthrew the only democratic government the country ever had. We supported their opponent in a war that cost them nearly 500,000 lives, and we continue to stoke aggression by bombing, assassinating, and sanctioning them. Maybe things could have been different had Mossadegh's government been allowed to live on. Maybe Iran could still be one of our closest allies in the Middle East, but our leadership made the decisions they did, and now we have to live with the consequences.